In 1776, 13 colonies ignited a revolution that would shake the world. Firebrand patriots declared independence, battled the British Empire and fought for liberty, but one neighbor, Canada, refused to join. Why did the land just north of the American colonies choose loyalty over rebellion? Was it fear, geography, culture, or something far deeper? Today we unravel the untold story of Canada's decision, a story of identity, survival, and a choice that would shape two nations forever. By the mid-18th century, the British Empire was a sprawling global force, its reach stretching from the coasts of Africa to the jungles of India, and across the icy waters of North America. In this grand chessboard of colonies, few territories held as much tension, ambition, and conflicting loyalties as the 13 American colonies. These colonies had grown accustomed to relative self-rule, yet they remained under the shadow of a distant king and parliament in London. Taxes imposed without representation, trade restrictions, and a growing sense of cultural distinctness began to fester into unrest. By the 1760s, this unrest was no longer subtle grumbling, it was boiling into organized opposition. Canada, on the other hand, was a very different world entirely. Only a decade before the revolutionary fervor gripped the southern colonies, Canada had been a prize taken by Britain from France after the 7 Years' War. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended a long struggle for continental supremacy, handing over Quebec and the surrounding territories to British control. The French-speaking Canadians, descendants of colonists who had lived there for generations, suddenly found themselves under the rule of a foreign power. Unlike the American colonies, where Protestant Anglo-Saxon settlers dominated, Canada was largely Catholic and French-speaking, a distinction that would play a central role in its hesitation to join the revolution. Yet even in this conquered land, British authorities were cautious. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 had already established boundaries intended to pacify indigenous nations and maintain peace in newly acquired territories. Quebec's population, largely rural and deeply tied to the Catholic Church, had little experience with self-government on the scale the Americans had pursued. Here, the population lived under the traditional seigneurial system, where local landlords and priests held immense influence over the everyday lives of settlers. The political culture was fundamentally different from the rebellious town meetings and pamphleteering that had become the lifeblood of American resistance. As news of colonial unrest spread, Canada became a focal point of revolutionary strategy and a test of loyalty. American leaders saw Quebec as a potential ally, a gateway to expand their rebellion northward. In 1775, just months before the Declaration of Independence, the Continental Army launched the invasion of Canada, hoping to bring the province into the revolutionary fold. But the campaign faced immense challenges. The harsh Canadian winters, dense forests, and unfamiliar terrain slowed the American forces, while logistical failures and disease decimated their ranks. Even before the first battles began, the question loomed: would the Canadians rise to join the American cause, or remain loyal to the crown that had promised stability after the upheaval of French rule? The answer lay as much in identity as in military strategy. For many Canadians, loyalty to Britain was pragmatic rather than ideological. They remembered the chaotic wars of the 18th century, the destruction wrought by conquest, and the promises made by the new rulers to respect their religion and property. Unlike the American rebels who fought for abstract ideals of freedom and representation, many Canadians prioritized survival, order, and the preservation of their way of life. The British, astutely aware of this, moved quickly to solidify loyalty through political concessions, protections for the Catholic Church, and limited local governance, creating an environment where rebellion seemed less urgent and more dangerous. At the same time, the social and economic structure of Canada played a decisive role. Agriculture dominated the economy, and trade networks were heavily dependent on Britain. Merchants and traders feared the disruption of rebellion, knowing that siding with the Americans could bring retaliation from both British authorities and neighboring Indigenous nations, who controlled critical trade routes. Furthermore, communication between revolutionary leaders and the Canadian populace was inconsistent at best. Letters, pamphlets, and emissaries struggled to overcome language barriers, cultural differences, and the skepticism of a population that had already endured the turbulence of conquest and new rule. In essence, the revolution that inspired so many in the South failed to ignite the same fire in the North. By the end of 1775, as American forces retreated from Quebec City after bitter fighting, it became increasingly clear: the Canadians were not joining the rebellion. Their refusal was not rooted in apathy but in a complex blend of loyalty, pragmatism, and cultural identity. The American dream of a united front against Britain would falter at the border. And yet, this decision would have consequences far beyond the battlefield, shaping the trajectory of two nations in ways that remain felt even today. In the fall of 1775, the Continental Army, emboldened by early successes in New England, set its sights northward. Their goal was audacious: to bring Canada into the Revolution, topple British rule, and add another colony to the fledgling fight for independence. Commanded by General Richard Montgomery and Benedict Arnold, the Americans embarked on what would become one of the most daring campaigns of the Revolutionary War. Yet even as they marched through dense forests and frozen rivers, little did they realize the depth of the challenges awaiting them, and the strength of Canadian loyalty to the Crown. The Americans faced logistical nightmares from the outset. The winter was merciless, rivers froze and thawed unpredictably, and the dense Canadian wilderness slowed every movement. Arnold's contingent, moving separately, struggled through rugged terrain, often surviving on meager rations and facing frostbite. Meanwhile, Montgomery's forces pushed through Quebec's outskirts, hoping that Canadians would rise in sympathy with the revolutionary cause. But the population they encountered was cautious, wary, and often indifferent to the distant arguments of freedom preached by Southern rebels. For many Canadians, life had taught that sudden change, especially violent upheaval, brought far more danger than benefit. When Montgomery's troops finally reached the walls of Quebec City in December, they were met with a city fortified and prepared. The British commander, General Guy Carleton, had anticipated unrest and reinforced the city's defenses. Inside, the population rallied behind the Crown, spurred by a combination of fear, faith, and a promise that loyalty would protect their religion, property, and lives. Many French-speaking Canadians had lived under British rule for only a decade but had already seen the dangers of war firsthand. Memories of the 7 Years' War and the devastation that followed French defeat were still fresh. For them, siding with the Americans seemed not heroic but reckless. The siege itself was brutal. On the night of December 31, 1775, Montgomery and Arnold launched a desperate assault on the city. Snow fell heavily, and the bitter wind sliced through soldiers' clothing like knives. Montgomery, leading a frontal attack, was killed in the assault, while Arnold was wounded and forced to retreat. The failed attack shattered American morale, and the dream of a Canadian uprising crumbled alongside it. Small pockets of rebel support did exist, mostly among English-speaking merchants and a handful of settlers in Montreal who saw opportunity in aligning with the Americans. But these were exceptions, not the rule. The larger population remained steadfast, reluctant to risk their homes and families for an uncertain cause. Religion played a subtle but critical role in this allegiance. The American colonies were largely Protestant, and their revolutionary rhetoric often carried undertones that alarmed the Catholic Church. For many Canadians, the Church was the backbone of daily life, guiding education, social structure, and community leadership. British authorities, recognizing this, had worked to secure the Church's support through legal protections and promises of autonomy. Aligning with the Americans could mean undermining this vital institution, a risk few were willing to take. Priests in Quebec preached loyalty as both a moral and practical duty, warning that rebellion would invite chaos and suffering. In this way, faith and survival became intertwined, further tipping the balance against revolution. Economic realities also reinforced caution. Canada's economy was tightly woven into the British mercantile system. Fur traders, farmers, and merchants relied on connections with Britain for supplies, credit, and access to international markets. The Americans, though ideologically inspiring, could offer no such stability. For those who calculated risk in practical terms, loyalty to Britain was not a matter of patriotism but of survival. Even when Americans promised opportunity and the ideals of liberty, the uncertainty of revolution, disease, food shortages, and the threat of reprisal outweighed the abstract benefits they offered. Indigenous alliances further complicated matters. Indigenous nations across the Northern Territories had long been critical players in North American conflicts, and both the British and the Americans recognized their strategic importance. Many Indigenous communities chose to support the British or remain neutral, seeing the Americans as intruders with tenuous claims to the land. Without Indigenous cooperation, the Americans struggled to secure supply lines and navigate the vast Canadian wilderness. The British, in contrast, leveraged these alliances effectively, solidifying their defensive position and discouraging Canadian settlers from rebelling. As the winter wore on, the American forces became increasingly desperate. Sickness, starvation, and freezing temperatures took a toll far beyond what the British defenses alone could achieve. Arnold's battered troops eventually retreated, and the hope of Canadian rebellion dwindled. In the end, the siege failed not solely because of military strategy but because of a profound misreading of Canadian society. The revolution, fueled by ideology, assumed a cultural and political alignment that simply did not exist north of the border. For the Canadians, the choice was clear. Risk everything for a foreign cause or protect what they had, preserving lives, faith, and community. By early 1776, the Continental Army had withdrawn from Canadian territory, leaving behind a nation that had resisted the lure of revolution. While the Americans would eventually secure independence to the south, Canada remained a loyal British colony, a decision shaped by history, culture, religion, and the harsh realities of life on the northern frontier. It was a choice that would define the country's path for decades, setting Canada on a trajectory distinct from its southern neighbors. After the American retreat from Quebec in early 1776, the Canadian landscape was left scarred by conflict yet remarkably intact. The cities, towns, and rural settlements had endured the direct threat of invasion, but the population had weathered both winter and war without surrendering to revolutionary ideals. In the months and years that followed, a pattern became clear. Canada's identity was consolidating in ways fundamentally different from its southern neighbors. While the United States was forging itself through rebellion and ideological experimentation, Canada was shaping a nation defined by cautious pragmatism, cultural compromise, and a deeply rooted sense of loyalty. The French-speaking Canadians formed the backbone of this identity. 10 years under British rule had already taught them a lesson that many American revolutionaries ignored. Survival often demanded pragmatism over principle. The British Crown, acutely aware of the demographic and cultural challenges of Quebec, had passed the Quebec Act of 1774, a law that would prove pivotal in solidifying loyalty. The act guaranteed the free practice of Catholicism, restored French civil law for private matters, and allowed the Church to maintain its influential role in society. For a population that had lived under French rule for generations, these concessions were more than legal technicalities. They were a promise that their culture, faith, and social structures would survive. In essence, the British had offered a form of stability that the American revolutionaries could not match. At the same time, British officials deliberately cultivated the loyalty of English-speaking settlers and merchants, who had migrated to Canada during or after the 7 Years' War. These communities were often more sympathetic to British economic and political structures, and they provided vital support in trade, governance, and defense. By weaving together these diverse communities under a framework of pragmatic governance, the British created a mosaic of loyalty, rather than demanding blind obedience. Canadians were not forced to choose blindly, rather they were presented with a path that promised security, religious freedom, and a degree of self-governance, all without the catastrophic risks of revolution. Indigenous nations were another critical factor in shaping Canadian allegiance. Many Indigenous communities had lived through decades of warfare and treaty negotiations, and they understood the importance of strategic alliances. During the American Revolution, Indigenous groups carefully evaluated which side offered the best prospects for their survival and territorial security. While some allied with the Americans, many remained loyal to the British or maintained neutrality, recognizing that rebellion in Canada threatened not only British authority but also the delicate balance that protected their own lands. This alignment further strengthened the position of British forces and reinforced Canadian reluctance to join the revolutionary cause. The lived experience of ordinary Canadians also shaped their choices. Farmers, traders, and villagers had endured decades of upheaval. The conquest of New France, the imposition of British rule, and the sporadic violence of frontier life. For them, the American Revolution was not a distant ideological struggle but a practical question of safety and survival. Letters from American emissaries promising liberty and shared purpose often fell on skeptical ears. Liberty meant little if it came at the cost of burned homes, famine, and the collapse of social order. The lessons of history were clear. Upheaval could be catastrophic while loyalty could bring protection. Religion remained a central pillar of loyalty and identity. The Catholic Church, still deeply embedded in the social fabric, worked closely with both communities and authorities to ensure order. Priests preached the virtues of prudence and faith, warning that rebellion could lead to ruin. This moral guidance resonated with a population for whom religious observance was inseparable from daily life. It also created a sense of collective purpose. Loyalty to the Crown was not merely political but a moral imperative, a way to preserve the sanctity and stability of their communities. The long-term consequences of these decisions were profound. By refusing to join the American Revolution, Canada avoided the widespread destruction and political experimentation that defined the United States. Instead, it evolved under a framework of British legal, political, and cultural influence. This allowed the provinces to develop systems of governance that balanced local needs with imperial oversight, laying the groundwork for the confederation that would eventually form modern Canada. The decision also shaped Canadian attitudes toward authority, risk, and community, fostering a culture that valued caution, negotiation, and compromise over revolutionary upheaval. In the broader North American context, Canada's loyalty created a stark contrast with its southern neighbor. While the United States pursued independence through conflict, Canada solidified its identity through measured pragmatism. The shared history of conquest, war, and negotiated governance created a society where culture, faith, and law were intertwined in ways that both protected and defined its people. This was not a tale of passive obedience but of calculated survival, a deliberate choice to prioritize long-term stability over immediate ideals. By the time the Revolutionary War drew to a close in 1783, Canada had emerged not as a secondary stage of rebellion but as a distinct nation. Its citizens had made a conscious choice to remain loyal, a choice rooted in centuries of history, cultural identity, and practical governance. The American victory to the south only highlighted the differences. Two nations born of the same continent, forged in vastly different circumstances, and committed to divergent paths. Canada's refusal to join the revolution was more than a military or political decision. It was a foundational moment in the creation of a national identity, one that would resonate for generations to come. While Canada officially remained loyal to the British Crown, the Revolutionary War was far from a distant story for ordinary Canadians. Families on the frontiers lived with constant uncertainty, and the northern borderlands became a stage for spies, skirmishes, and secret alliances. The war may not have swept through the Canadian countryside as dramatically as it did in Massachusetts or Virginia, but its effects were felt in quiet, often invisible ways, through letters intercepted, neighbors suspected of treachery, and the ever-present fear of American raiders crossing the frozen frontier. One such figure was Joseph Brant, a Mohawk leader whose actions underscore the complex allegiances during the Revolution. Brant allied with the British, recognizing that the Americans' expansionist ambitions threatened Indigenous lands. Yet his involvement was not just political, it was deeply personal. Brant's leadership in the northern campaigns demonstrated the intricate web of loyalties in Canada, where Indigenous strategy, European colonial power, and local settler interests intersected. He led raids against American outposts, protected Canadian settlements, and even facilitated communication between Loyalist communities and British command, revealing that the Revolution's shadow stretched far beyond the southern colonies. The Canadian militias were also pivotal, though their stories rarely reach popular history. Composed of both French and English-speaking settlers, these militias were tasked with defending communities from potential American incursions. Men like Pierre-François de Rigaud, Marquis de Vaudreuil, and local parish leaders organized patrols, managed supply routes, and trained volunteers to resist attack. Their lives were defined by vigilance. A single night of vulnerability could bring devastation, and the fear of American sympathizers often required delicate balancing acts. Loyalty in Canada was not a passive sentiment. It demanded readiness, sacrifice, and sometimes deadly confrontation. Espionage added another layer to Canadian involvement. Both British and American forces sought intelligence in Canadian towns, rivers, and forests. Letters, coded messages, and covert meetings were common, as local citizens navigated the dangerous space between allegiance and survival. Merchants and tradespeople could find themselves caught between rival spies, their homes searched for evidence, and their loyalties questioned. The choice to remain neutral or even quietly loyal was often the only path to safety. In this way, Canada's decision to stay loyal was reinforced by everyday risk. The potential consequences of siding with the revolutionaries were immediate and personal. The revolution also impacted Canadian society in subtler, social ways. News of battles, victories, and American propaganda filtered slowly through towns and villages, sparking debates in local cafes, churches, and markets. Families discussed the distant war as they would any major event, but with the underlying recognition that their own survival depended on prudence. Children grew up hearing tales of the American rebels' audacity, yet also the folly of their failed Canadian campaigns. These stories became part of a shared memory, shaping a generation that would inherit a nation defined by caution, resilience, and loyalty to established structures. Even after the war ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Canadians continued to deal with its reverberations. Loyalists fleeing the newly formed United States arrived in waves, swelling the population of Upper Canada and bringing new skills, traditions, and cultural influences. Their presence further reinforced Canadian loyalty, injecting a sense of purpose and community into provinces that had been on the fringes of the conflict. The shared experience of hosting displaced families, defending borders and navigating political shifts strengthened the bonds between settlers, Indigenous allies and British authorities, creating a society uniquely prepared to withstand external pressures. In this way, Canada's role during the American Revolution was not passive or irrelevant. It was active, strategic, and deeply human. People lived with uncertainty, made life-or-death decisions, and built a society that prioritized survival, faith, and continuity over ideological adventure. While Americans fought for liberty and a radical break with tradition, Canadians quietly preserved theirs by choosing order over chaos, a choice that would ripple through history, shaping the identity and political culture of the nation for generations. Canada's refusal to join the American Revolution was more than a simple act of loyalty. It was a defining moment in the making of a nation. Geography, culture, religion, economy, and lived experience all combined to guide a people toward prudence rather than rebellion. The harsh winters, the memory of conquest, and the promise of protection under British rule created a compelling alternative to revolutionary risk. Canadians chose survival, community, and continuity, laying the foundation for a nation distinct from its southern neighbor. Today, this decision reminds us that history is rarely shaped by a single cause or heroic gesture. It is the result of countless small choices, made by ordinary people navigating extraordinary circumstances. Canada's story during the Revolution is a testament to pragmatism, resilience, and the subtle ways identity is forged, not in the heat of dramatic battles alone, but in the careful preservation of what matters most. In choosing loyalty, Canadians preserved their land, culture, and faith, ensuring that when the dust of revolution settled to the south, the northern frontier remained a land of order, negotiation, and enduring heritage.